The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse is a green electricity supplier, which means they generate all their energy from renewables. And they're actually offering a new bundle for anyone who switches to Fuse. And included in this, you'll be pleased to hear, is some merch. Alastair's hoodie, baseball caps, mugs. The Rest is Politics merch you may have seen on tour.
And all you got to do to get it is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics. And so the merch is great, but more important is actually that if you do switch to Fuse, you're going to find you get your energy cheaper than with all the other big companies.
And they invest 100% of their profits back into renewables. They also now offer 24/7 support, which you can access through the Fuse app.
So dead easy, getfuse.com/politics, referral code politics, find out how to get your merch, how to switch to Fuse, and how to save yourself money. Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
We should devote a huge chunk of today's episode to continue to talk about Syria. And then I think we should talk about France. Macron is meeting some of the parties this afternoon, Tuesday, to try to decide a way forward following the fall of the Barnier government. And then I think we should also talk about reform. I had an interesting few hours with Nigel Farage up in Lincoln before question time.
Yeah.
I think I got a sense of what he's up to and why he's got a bit of a spring in his step. So let's start with Syria. I mean, it is absolutely huge stuff, this. And I think we were right on Sunday amid the kind of sense of celebration that one of the most murderous, butchering regimes of all time has fallen, to underline that these are pretty tense, nervous times as well.
So clearly the anxiety is what's coming next. Is it going to be an Islamist regime? Is it going to be a new form of civil war? And there's every reason for people to be cautious. But before anyone starts celebrating Bashar al-Assad's regime, I think it's worth reminding people, and maybe I'll hand over to you on this, a little bit about what we're now seeing out of the prisons and just how horrifying Bashar al-Assad's regime was, almost regardless of what now replaces it.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that because the world has sort of taken its eye away from Syria, so much else going on, and because Assad seems to have survived the civil war, not least with the support of Putin's air force, I think what is coming out of the prisons underlines why, for example, the United Nations human rights guy, Volker Turk, has been clear that this guy has to be pursued in any which way possible for war crimes and for crimes against humanity. Almost worse than the treatment in prisons, although that was horrific. And I don't know if you've seen, Rory, you've seen pictures of people leaving these prisons who don't know what their name is, don't know where they live, don't recognize their families. And some of the stories, I mean, there's a guy, apparently, who was in there for 21 years. And do you know what his crime was?
No.
He beat Assad's brother, Bassel, who died he would have been the leader. He died in a car crash a while back. But he beat him in an equestrian event. And he got sentenced to 21 years. There are stories coming out of people who were told in front of others to sodomize and or murder their relatives in prison, and then to have themselves sodomized by those. This is stuff that's now going to come out. Al-Jilani, who I see is taking to using his real name,
right,
now that he's in there. I didn't realize, by the way, that apparently Al-Jilani means from Golan.
That's right. Some of my Syrian friends actually call him Al-Golani.
Yeah.
They're using the G instead of the J. His name, Al-Jilani, actually means of the Golan. And we can talk a little bit about him in a second. But yes, just finish your thought there.
He's now essentially saying that, I mean, on the one hand, this is what's really interesting about their strategy. This is the HTS group that has kind of been the biggest of the groups that has brought this downfall of Assad. And he is a pretty charismatic guy who's clearly established himself as a leadership figure. But on the one hand, part of the strategy is to say we're going to be inclusive. I am not Al-Qaeda. I've divorced myself from all that. I'm a different sort of person, and I'm going to try to bring this country together. On the other hand, unsurprisingly, I think most would agree, he's saying they will name the people within the regime that they think do have to be punished for torture, for crimes against humanity, whatever it might be. And I think this stuff with the prisons, and when you saw the pictures yesterday of these thousands of people turning up to see whether their relatives might be emerging from the prisons, because the other thing that it wasn't just the prisoners, it was the whole thing about the disappeared. People who were literally just grabbed by people, by plainclothes officers usually, their families never told where they would be. Then lots of kind of organized crime around that, people being bribed. We've got information, we can give you information, but you must pay it for us. And so there were hundreds,
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of people who just nobody knows where they've gone. Many will be dead. And the other story that came out last night I saw was that somebody had gone into a morgue and just find piles of bodies that had clearly been tortured. So this is horrific stuff that's emerging.
Yes. And that then shows the type of challenges that you face in a country like this. And it was similar in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, who ran the most unbelievably brutal torture chambers, murder operations. It was true after the fall of Gaddafi, was true after the fall of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And in every one of these situations, you're dealing with so much injustice and trauma, but it's not just in one dimension, it's in multiple dimensions. So, firstly, what do you do about the former regime
Yeah.
elements? In other words, what do you do about the senior generals, ministers who really made this whole thing work? To what extent do you do truth and reconciliation? You know, get this stuff out in the open in the way that people pioneered in Rwanda? Do you follow a South African approach? Do you try to go for some form of denazification? In this case, it's the old Syrian Ba'ath Party. And that, of course, rings alarm bells from Iraq, where we
Mhm.
interviewed General David Petraeus on debathification. And you were just talking to me about this morning, remembering that he had talked about that going too far down. Just remind people a little bit about that point about Petraeus and debathification.
Well, debathification essentially was the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's party. Essentially, part of the thinking was you have to completely get rid of any elements of the Ba'ath Party within the governing system. And the point that David Petraeus was making was that you've got the top layers who are totally signed up to there it would be Saddam, here it would be Assad project, but then beneath that, do you have some acceptance of people who literally were, quotes, just doing their jobs, but have the technocratic, bureaucratic experience that a new government would need? And Petraeus was making the point that by essentially going for complete debathification, not fully, but effectively complete debathification, it meant that the governance that they were building was a lot weaker than it otherwise might have been.
And in addition, you create a group of highly organized, very bitter armed rebels
Yeah.
who, in the case of the Iraq regime, turned out to have massive weapon piles and to have teamed up with a man who we'll talk about in a little bit, called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the man that came out on Saddam Hussein's invitation, it's now clear, in 2002, and began organizing jihadi groups in Iraq in preparation for the US led invasion.
Mm.
And the reason he's relevant is that Jalani, who's now taken over Syria, started his professional career as a jihadist, as a terrorist fighter in Iraq under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. This was a world of people like Zarqawi who had been essentially growing up in a sort of lower middle class life in Jordan. He'd done a bit of drugs, did a bit of gambling. He'd found himself in prison. In prison, he'd apparently found God. He'd become quite a sort of amateur preacher. He'd got involved in Afghanistan. He'd linked into Al Qaeda. He blew up a wedding party in Jordan, killing an enormous number of people. And then when he arrived in Iraq, he went on a killing spree, which was not just about very, very brutal public execution of Western hostages. I mean, you remember those images of people
Mm.
standing, pleading for their lives, but also an enormous amount of deliberate killing of Iraqi Shia communities in order to stir up sectarian warfare. He went so far that even the Al Qaeda leadership reached out to him in 2005 to say, rein it in a bit. You're beginning to get so cruel and mad that you're pushing it too far. And it's his successors that become two of the most important people in our story. One of them is this man called al-Baghdadi, who ends up setting up ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, which creates this massive state in 2014 from Mosul to eastern Syria, this caliphate, which fought on in Mosul until 2017.
Hmm.
And the other lot was al-Jilani. And al-Jilani was senior enough to be sent to set up Al Qaeda in Syria. So he comes out of prison having been fighting on the front line in Iraq, and he's right at the very top of the organization. He says he wasn't that close to Zarqawi. Well, the guy that you send from Iraq to set up your franchise in Syria, which is your most important other country, must have been right at the very, very top of this Al Qaeda Daesh merged organization.
Mm.
And then the question is, what happens? And he says that he realized that Daesh was too extreme and he broke from them first. And then he realized Al Qaeda was too extreme and he broke from them. And he's part of a tradition which the Taliban is part of saying, okay, let's take the emphasis on fighting the far enemy, fighting the United States and its allies. Let's focus instead on what we do inside this country. Let's create links with local communities. Let's understand the tribal structure. Let's deliver services. And let's create our Al Qaeda Islamist state inside Syria instead of getting involved in international head. And let's do it gently. Let's not kill minority groups. Let's not start throwing homosexuals off roofs, at least not initially. That's where the
Mm.
worry lies, until we manage to consolidate the country. Back over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Taliban, because the Taliban put out a statement welcoming the arrival of these guys as kind of they seem to be suggesting sort of ideological brothers. But Al Jilani's sort of rhetoric and presentation has not been going down that route. I read a very interesting piece this morning on The Conversation by a guy called William Plowright, who is an academic at Durham University, but who spent 2013 in Syria. And he was reporting on the conversations he had with the people who emerged from these groups that you're talking about. And the central point he makes, and I don't know anything about this guy, so I don't know what his politics are, I don't know what his views on the Middle East are, but he made a really interesting point, which I think relates to something that Jonathan Powell, currently Keir Starmer's national security advisor, who was very important in our Northern Ireland peace process. Jonathan was always of the view that in most circumstances it is worth talking to terrorists. Okay. And what this guy, William Plowright, is saying is that the sense he got from talking to all of these people was that if the international community does talk to them, rather than just kind of cast them out and say they're beyond the pale the whole time, that actually they can be shaped. It would be very interesting the extent to which all the intelligence agencies right now will be all over this stuff as much as they can be, trying to find out who's in with whom, who can you push this direction, who can you push that direction.
And your point about the intelligence agencies is critical because, as I know and as you know, their job is to think about the worst case scenario. So if you're the policymaker, if you're Jonathan Powell or Keir Starmer or an incoming Trump administration, you take very seriously what the intelligence agencies are saying, but you also have to bear in mind that their job is often to emphasize the negative. And what they will be saying, and I've talked to some of them, is these guys have a very, very deep, dark history.
Yeah.
The second thing is you've made the Taliban analogy, and I think the Taliban is a really good way of understanding this. The Taliban in Afghanistan at the moment, Taliban 2.0, is very different from Taliban 1.0, right? The lot that were in before 9/11. They haven't been embarking on a genocidal campaign against the Shia, so they've been more tolerant of minority groups. And Bamiyan is a very different place. I was there in August from what it was 23 years ago. They haven't done these mass public executions. They've kept security. There haven't been mass reprisals. So the UN reckons something like 350 people have been executed, which is a very large number, but nothing compared to what Taliban were expected to do over 3 years.
They're going the whole hog on women's rights, though, aren't they?
Exactly. But it turns out that what they're doing is they are running a gender apartheid state. And so the challenge for Plowright and the challenge for Hassan, who I'm a real admirer of and knows this stuff better than almost anyone else, and will share what the global war on terror really accomplished, which is an amazing article he's written in New Lines magazine, where he says that what the global war on terror accomplished was not getting rid of these groups, but making them more domestic. He basically says the lesson that Al Qaeda took from the global war on terror is if you give up on attacking the US, Europe, and just focus on your own country, you'll be left alone. Well, up to a point, because if you see the coverage on the Taliban over the last 2 weeks, it's profoundly uncomfortable for the West to think about this. On the one hand, there's much more security. When we were in Afghanistan, there were 30, 40,000 people a year dying in conflict, and now there isn't. And people have breathed a sigh of relief about that. On the other hand, it's an Islamist gender apartheid state with a mullah issuing more and more extreme edicts from Kandahar. So I think that's a sort of clue to what the Gilani problem may be. He may turn out not to want to go to war with the US, may not even want to go to war with Israel, may not be killing Druze or Alawites, maybe, but he will be running a very authoritarian regime, and there's absolutely no doubt that he's coming from an Islamist Sharia law background.
Just on Israel, you mentioned Israel there. And of course, the other big thing that's happening at the moment is that the Israelis are very active in bombing inside Syria sites that they believe are related to the arms that exist there, to the weapons programs that exist there. One of the reasons why Israel felt not comfortable with Assad, but Assad never got too bothered when the Israelis were bombing what they viewed as Iranian sites. Now, it's been interesting to me that I haven't seen any kind of reaction to these Israeli bombings by the HTS people. So that may be because I just haven't not aware of it, but that feels what the Israelis are saying, of course, is that we have to prevent these chemical weapons programs in particular getting into the wrong hands, and that would of course be terrorist Islamist organizations, and which could become the government. So that's another kind of piece of this jigsaw which is really quite difficult and complicated.
And Egypt has been drawing attention to the fact that Israel has also taken more territory in Syria around the Golan
Yeah,
Heights. So the Golan Heights,
yeah.
for people who don't focus on this all the time, it's a little bit of territory nestling between Jordan, Syria, and Israel, just on the northeast edge of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus was walking on water and pulling out the fish and that kind of stuff. And it's Syrian territory. It was captured by Israel after the 1967 war. So it's illegally occupied under international law. And Syria continued to hold bits of it, which Israel have now just retaken in the last few days.
Yeah.
Netanyahu says temporarily. And of course, the whole Arab world says, well, that's what you said after 1967, that it was all temporary.
Mm.
And I guess one of the issues to think about, apart from how the international community responds to Israel taking territory in Syria, is you pointed to the fact that Jelani's name reminds us that his family come from the Golan Heights.
Though he was raised in Saudi.
He was raised in Saudi, but the reason he was raised in Saudi, his father was an activist who then became very close to the Palestinian cause, was closely linked to the Black September movement, which was an attempt of the PLO to take over Jordan. And he himself, Jelani claims the reason he went out to do jihad in Iraq is he was moved by the Intifada in Palestine. So there are two things going on in Jelani's head, I would suggest. On the one hand, the lesson he's drawn from the global war on terror is stay within your own borders and you'll be okay. On the other hand, he has deep family roots through his father and through his own life connected to Golan and the Palestinian cause, which may begin to make Israel a little bit uncomfortable of a large armed jihadist group on its border, whose leader, and all of whose senior leadership, even if they're domestically focused, the one thing that they all have in common is a profound hostility towards Israel.
I said when we talked on Sunday, I said about the lunch that we had with Assad in Downing Street. And one thing I do remember was that actually he didn't go, in terms of his rhetoric, he didn't really go after Israel in the way that some Arab leaders do. He was very much focused on America. And his anti-Americanism was really profound. The truth is that since October the 7th and since the Israeli response to that, Syria has been a much quieter voice on this than, say, Turkey. Erdogan has really been kind of a very, very voluble about his views of what Israel is doing in Gaza, whereas Assad has, not been much of a voice in this at all. So I think that is why Israel is reacting in the way that it is basically saying, look, you may see this as an opportunity to sort of up the dial on Gaza, but just remember, militarily, we've kind of got more than you have.
Yep, exactly. And as you pointed out, they haven't just taken out the chemical weapons, they've taken out pretty much all their missiles, land to land missiles, land to sea, land to air. I mean, they've basically wiped out most of the Syrian artillery or their advanced artillery.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of brings us on to the other big question, which is Syria is, to put it mildly, not a homogenous place. We talked in the last podcast in detail about the different religious and sectarian groups, 16 different Christian groups, the Druze, the Alawite, Sunni, two different types of Shia, etc. But this is also true of the different armed groups that Jelani now has to deal with and the non-armed groups. So different armed groups, there is the Free Syrian Army, there are former regime elements who will still have their weapons, Alawite militias, there will be Arab groups coming up from the south, and above all, there will be the Kurds, east of the Euphrates, very heavily armed, supported by the US and the UK in the past to fight against Daesh and Mosul, very, very heavily supplied. And you will also have, of course, non-armed groups. I mean, Syria had a very strong tradition in a way Afghanistan didn't of a very large intellectual, educated middle class before the 2011 catastrophe, many of whom are much more liberal and secular in their views. And I was just speaking to Simon Collis again this morning, our former ambassador in Damascus, who was pointing out that his very close Syrian friends said to him, the first thing they said is, what on earth is Jelani doing? He's just appointed a prime minister in Damascus who was the guy that ran Idlib. Where was the due process? What right has he to appoint a prime minister? Now, it sounds a bit comical, but I guess what you're thinking about there is they're stepping back and saying, wait a sec, we're being very pleased with the fact he's taken over. But what on earth's happening here? It turns out this guy just gets to appoint a prime minister. There's no elections, there's no. And that's the beginning of the clue of what will become a big rift between him and the more liberal, city based, urban, educated bits of Syria.
Is this not just a case of to the victor the spoils? And that's why it's been so important that he's established himself in the way that he did. That visit that he made immediately he got there to the mosque. He's clearly somebody who has thought through how he is going to project himself in these early days.
He did media studies. You followed that. His degree was in media
I
studies.
did, and I watched the CNN interview
Yeah.
that you recommended, and it was really, really interesting because he's worked out how to do this stuff.
What did you notice about that? Just sort of when you say he worked out how to do this stuff, what did you notice?
There's nothing he said that would upset his closest supporters,
Right.
but the means by which he was communicating it was pretty much directed towards the audience that he expected to be watching.
And he never got irritated, did he? Because she basically asks him 3 times, wait a sec, you're an Al-Qaeda terrorist. How can we believe you've changed?
He was very calm, quite soft-spoken, good eye contact, clear. He was clear. I thought he was impressive, even in that Western context, because a lot of these guys, when we interviewed the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, do you remember one of the things we said was that his mode of communication was very different
Yeah.
to what you see if you see a lot of
Yep.
Arab leaders
Yep.
in their own media
Yep.
environment,
Yep.
because it can be very aggressive the whole time. And I think he's worked that out. And even the way he stood in that mosque,
Yep.
he was surrounded by everybody filming on their bloody mobile phones, as everybody does these days. But it was pretty planned. I mean, you don't go into a mosque and find the right level of box.
Yep. Yeah.
He stands on it. Everybody surrounds him. The cameras are there. No, I think he's worked on this stuff.
There's still a $10 million bounty on his head. And I was thinking about this because we sort of take it for granted, but it's actually stranger and more interesting than maybe we acknowledge. America is still continuing a system of bounties that basically goes back to the Revolutionary War and then the Wild West.
Yeah.
You can literally get $10 million presented to you in a check. I don't know whether it's tax-free, from President Biden at the White House. That's one thing. The second thing is this designation of foreign terrorist organizations, and this is going to be really important. So you go on the State Department website, I just did it. There are 69 organizations, some of which, to be honest, I never heard of, which are listed as terrorist organizations by the State Department. If you're listed as a terrorist organization, it's a criminal offense to provide financial assistance to them. That sounds very straightforward, but get this. When we were running Turquoise Mountain in Afghanistan immediately after the Taliban took over, one of the first bits of advice we got is that we couldn't fill our cars. We couldn't fill our cars because if you buy petrol, VAT or fuel duty goes to the government. So by filling your car, you could be accused by the Department of Justice for financing a foreign terrorist organization and end up spending many, many years in jail, and your NGO gets shut down. So for NGOs, UN, anyone trying to get into reconstruction in Syria,
Yeah.
all of them will be talking to lawyers and asking the question of whether the US and UK are going to lift this terrorist designation, and whether particularly US Treasury are going to provide exemptions for things like filling your car. Until that point, you can't operate.
Well, listen, that's maybe a good point to sort of go to what European governments will be having to address now, because one of them is the issue of whether this remains a prescribed organisation. David Lammy was asked about it when he did a statement in Parliament, and I thought I thought the tone was the right tone. He was essentially saying they are a prescribed organisation. We'll judge them not on what they say, but on what they do. So kind of fairly open-minded. Meanwhile, I've got no doubt whatsoever that CIA, MI6, DSG people, they will all be talking to these people as much as they can. The other issue, which I think has been interesting to see the reaction to, is the whole thing about immigration. Because again, two things going on. The first is there are 14 million Syrians who have been forced to flee their homes. Okay. A lot of those have gone to Turkey, to
Lebanon, Jordan. Yeah.
and you've seen the pictures on TV of the sort of lots of people at the border with Lebanon trying to get back. Equally, people trying to leave because there'll be people worried. You know, some of the people who were close to the regime might be worried, so they're trying to get out. Meanwhile, in Europe, first out of the traps, I think, were the Austrians, pretty right-wing Chancellor Karl Nehammer, straight out there saying, essentially saying, "Okay, Syrians, we put up you with it for a while, but I'm really paraphrasing here, Rory, but time for you to go home."
And just to interrupt for a second, I mean, I've seen a bit of this. It's a bit weird because it's literally 5 days after
Yeah.
an Al Qaeda linked $10 million bounty foreign terrorist leader has taken over the country. You might give it a few days to settle down before you boot people out.
Let me tell you what he said. He said, "We will support all Syrians who found refuge in Austria and want to return to their home country. The security situation must be reassessed in order to make deportations possible again in the future." So, pretty clear direction of travel. Germany, UK, and others are essentially freezing asylum applications by Syria. So, in Germany, you've got almost 50,000 Syrians who are currently waiting for an answer. I think the number in Britain, I know that between 2011 and 2021, we granted 30,000 Syrians asylum in the UK. So Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, she too has sort of said, we're pausing these decisions in relation to Syria. So I think that is the kind of right approach. But it just underlines that this is one of those situations that's going to have ramifications, obviously in Syria, in the region, but countries around the world. You're seeing this in Germany, for example, and we should here mention we talked to Angela Merkel in the interview that's out on Leading at the moment. Famously, she said that thing, "Wir schaffen das," when she took in 1 million Syrians when the refugee crisis was on. And there's no doubt that has made politics in Germany much harder. The debate about asylum and immigration and refugees is in a different place to where it was. So this is going to be a challenge for European governments as well.
It's a real reminder. I mean, Syria is the most dramatic reminder of why global security matters. I mean, often the temptation is in an age where people are understandably very concerned about living standards at home to think, look, we don't have the time or the energy to worry about what's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And that's very much, the Trump thing. Let's leave NATO. Let's stop international aid. Let's bring it all home. But Syria is such a good example. That conflict spilled 9 million refugees. It destabilized Lebanon, it destabilized Jordan, and it led to the rise of these populist far right parties in Europe directly off the back of the images, those millions of Syrians leaving. So it, keeping a more peaceful world, which used to be our objective before we gave up on it about 10 years ago, um, is really matters to us at home, matters to us right close. These things are not as far away as we think, particularly in a world where you can travel so much more easily.
Well, that's why it was so interesting to see the different responses of Biden and Trump. Joe Biden put out a statement, and to be fair to him, the support that he's given to Ukraine has weakened Russia. You could argue that the support that he's given to Israel in relation to the current conflict there has weakened Iran. And he was kind of he wasn't overdoing it, but he was taking a little bit of credit.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Donald Trump goes all caps on Truth Social. This has got nothing to do with us. We've got to stay out of this, overlooking the fact there are American troops in Syria.
There are American troops in Syria, both special forces, both in the south and in the northeast. And actually, CENTCOM has been doing bombing raids over the last couple of days. I mean, that's quite interesting, sort of reminder of how, at the moment at least, still under the remains of Biden administration, how quickly and immediately America moves to think, okay, there's a possibility that goods could be coming through from Iran, through this route from Iraq. We're going to hit them from the air in the immediate aftermath of this thing happening.
Well, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he echoed Netanyahu's point. He said, look, there's a real danger that the Islamic State group will try and, reestablish their sense of sort of, operations inside Syria. So, this is unbelievably complicated and difficult and very hard to see. I mentioned the UN. There was a meeting of the UN, but the UN Security Council, I thought it was really interesting. It felt to me almost like this was form. It didn't feel like they were making decisions. They were all saying things.
Yes, exactly. And some of this, how do you deal with a terrorist group? A group that used to show allegiance to this man, al-Zawahiri, who was bin Laden's deputy and successor, and that came out of this man, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was this kind of brutal Jordanian maniac who was killed by a US airstrike. How do you deal with a terrorist group? That's quite old stuff, which we've never been very good at. We've never really known what do you do with Hamas, Hezbollah, IRA, Al-Qaeda, but particularly Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda, was responsible for 9/11. I mean, you could not have a more iconic extreme group to be dealing with, right?
Yeah.
The second question, though, to segue to France, is how can Europe respond? Let's say Trump is going to follow through. Let's say he's serious, that he's not going to do anything in Syria. He's not going to provide people. He's not going to provide money. Traditionally, you would say, okay, this is where Europe might step up with development aid, reconstruction aid, not boots on the ground, but big, generous fund, because Syria matters to Europe, not least in terms of refugees. But can it do it in an era where Germany is very weak and France is very weak, and the two big traditional motors of Europe are struggling? And Alastair, you're in France, so that's exactly where we wanted to get to, because France, my goodness, is right in the center of world news at the moment.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. Notre Dame and the total collapse of the French government and the collapse of their prime minister. So over to you.
Well, it was sort of surreal the weekend. You saw these two Frances, really, because I don't know how much you followed the Notre Dame thing, but it was absolutely incredible. I started watching it and I couldn't stop. There was this incredible documentary on France 2 of the renovation. And it was like they had cameras around everything the whole time, including those cameras in the sky that show you the sort of how fast everything's being done. And just these incredible people who were like thousands of them, these tiny bits of restoration of art and of sculpture. And it was an amazing achievement. There was lots of world leaders, including Trump. Prince William was there, and leaders from around the world. And you had a sense of this is just an amazing country. And meanwhile, who was welcoming? Macron was welcoming the really big cheeses. who was welcoming everybody else? It was Michel Barnier, who's the prime minister whose government has just collapsed. So you have this sense of this amazing country that can do amazing things, yet whose politics right now feels in a complete mess. And, this goes back to Macron, who called this snap, dissolved the parliament, called a snap election, and the result basically is chaos, because there's none of the three big blocks, none of them can actually form a majority. So Barnier tried to get a budget through. The hard right and the hard left came together and defeated him. So this afternoon, Macron is sitting down in the Elysee with the leaders of political parties, apart from Mélenchon's lot on the hard left, who say they're having nothing to do with it. I think they could pay a price for that, but anyway, they're having nothing to do with it. And then on the hard right, Marine Le Pen's lot, who are essentially saying they don't like the format of the talks that he's proposing.
Without sort of over pushing a criticism of your friend, Monsieur Macron, to remind people that the first problem is this guy totally unnecessarily triggered an election. I mean, the guy's going to be president till April 2027. He's supposed to be president, right?
Yeah, he's got 30 months to go.
Yeah. So he had a slim but just about workable majority. He then triggered an election where he lost his majority, right? And the result is that we ended up, Le Pen didn't do as well as she hoped because he created an alliance.
Well, the left created an alliance.
Yeah, but he's cooperated with them by dropping
Yeah.
candidates, didn't he? So there's this funny system, sort of transferable vote system. And by very cleverly saying, we won't run against the left in certain seats, the left won't run against us.
Yeah.
He squeezed Le Pen's party. But there's a number of tactical problems with this. Tactical problem number one, he blows his majority, which is a fundamental problem. Tactical problem number two is he runs an election where he basically works together with the left to defeat Le Pen. And then he forms a government which is almost entirely dependent on Le Pen against the left, right?
Yeah, that's because what it goes to the heart of is that the right are refusing to countenance a left-wing prime minister. The left is refusing to countenance a right-wing prime minister. Barnier, to be fair to him, did a pretty good job at holding it together for as long as he did.
But as long as he did, in retrospect, turns out to have been a few weeks, right?
Yeah, shortest lived prime minister in the history of the Fifth Republic. But that is the fundamental problem that now exists. And so now they're kind of trying to find a replacement for Barnier. Hilariously, well, I say hilariously, it's not very funny if you're French. There was a poll in the weekend in Le Figaro, and when the French public are asked who of this list, they give it a very long list of names to choose as a possible prime minister. And guess who came top?
Who?
Michel Barnier.
Oh, great.
So the public basically, and look, I can't pretend I've been speaking to many people down here, but the ones I've talked to are basically saying they're not really. Macron's not popular, that's true, but the blame game is actually for the whole of the political class now. What are these people doing that they cannot get together and sort this out?
Okay, so to be pretentious for a second, I mean, part of the problem is that de Gaulle set up this system called the Fifth Republic in the 50s.
Yeah.
And what it creates is this hyper powerful president, which is what Emmanuel Macron is. I mean, far more powerful than almost any president on earth. People make jokes about him being like Napoleon or Louis XIV, and a very, very weak parliament. And that creates the mindset that the president gets to go on television whenever they want and give 2-hour lectures and pontificate at the Sorbonne and act like a sort of king and not pay much attention to their parliament. Except if you end up in a situation where you no longer have the governing party in parliament, in which case you can't pass a budget and you can't pass any legislation.
Yeah.
Then the challenge comes, if you are somebody like Macron, who has got slightly sort of big thinking, visionary tendencies.
We could call it leadership, Rory.
Leadership, yes. Are you going to make the concessions? Are you going to be flexible enough? Are you going to be skillful enough in doing this very difficult business of running a minority government? Let's say he continues with what he's doing at the moment, which is holding meetings which Mélenchon doesn't turn up to and Le Pen doesn't turn up to. Mélenchon has 71 seats. Le Pen has 124. He would literally have to get basically he'd have to do something very clever. He'd have to split the new Front Populaire, so split this sort of left-wing coalition.
Which has 193 seats,
Yeah.
by the way.
Getting rid of the Mélenchon bit, which is the far left, worse than Jeremy Corbyn, nutty bit of it.
Pro-Assad.
Pro-Assad, yeah. And get every single person basically in Parliament who isn't part of either Le Pen or Mélenchon to come with him. And I can't see that happening because all the evidence suggests that he's refusing really to accept what happened in this election. I mean, even that Barnier government that he formed had far too many people of his own party in it.
Mélenchon did an interview this morning where he, or was it yesterday? But he's got such a sort of sneery kind of tone and what have you. But where he had a point was in saying, look, you you called an election, it sort of blown the system up, but you now just want a government that's still a government in your image.
Yeah.
Well, that's not very democratic. So we're not going to play your games.
No, well, it also doesn't work, does it? I mean, you literally cannot lose your majority and then behave as though you've won the election and try to run a government which is stuffed full of your own people and basically ignore the people
Yeah.
that took all these seats.
The other thing that's happening, the watching the seating plan at the Notre Dame thing was pretty amazing. People watching. In comes Zelensky, who's sitting a few rows back. Zelensky gets this amazing round of applause that ripples around the church. In walks Trump, no applause at all. But Trump is going to be seated next to Macron
Right.
on one side and Mrs. Macron on the other side. This is a classic Macron
Yeah.
kind of big jest,
Yeah.
a grand geste. And to be fair to Macron, he got Zelensky and Trump together and
Yeah.
they had a decent
Yeah.
conversation, what have you. But while Macron was greeting the final people, it meant that for several minutes, who should be sitting next to each other in the front row of Notre Dame with just an empty chair between them, but Donald Trump and Jill Biden. Now I think that is horrific for Jill Biden. And to be Jill Biden, class act, she chatted away. Jill Biden's daughter, who was next to her,
she chatted to Trump.
She did, yeah.
And Trump made an effort, or seemed to make an effort, as far as one can see.
It's hard
Yeah.
to know.
Yeah.
See, as far as
Yeah.
you know. And then you had another leader, and then a little gap, and then it was Prince William.
And an interesting use of Prince William there, because he, I think, was asked to go by the British government. He will have been asked. Sorry, we know this from the way that the royal family work. The British government will have asked him to go. Foreign Secretary will have requested this, and will have requested it because they would hope that he would help to reinforce the relationship with Donald Trump. And their sense is that Donald Trump likes the monarchy.
Which duly happened. They had a 35-minute meeting I think it was at the American ambassador's residence. Trump put out this bizarre clip about how good looking Prince William is and he's much better looking in the flesh. But meanwhile talked about, how much the Queen loved him and all that stuff.
Can I ask, sorry, there were two people who were missing. Keir Starmer was missing, but perhaps more significant was Olaf Scholz, the German leader, was missing. And this was a hell of a big European moment. Donald Trump's there, Zelensky's there, Macron's there. And I know Scholz doesn't like Macron, and I know Scholz has got a lot of domestic problems at home. But that was strange for what could have been an interesting moment for European leaders coming together.
Well, I don't know what happened in relation to all the sort of invitations. Did Trump invite himself? Did Macron invite Trump? As you say, you'd assume that the government made the decision about Prince William, but actually might it have been, King Charles who said, I think the family should be there or whatever. But and also you have to remember the German president was there.
Right.
So Prince William's representing Britain. The German president is representing Eddie Rama. Our friend Eddie Rama was there, very noticeable, 5 rows behind Trump. Zelensky, as I say, got an amazing response. But the politics of the Macron-Trump-Zelensky meeting were very, very interesting. And again, goes back to my point. For Macron, had a pretty amazing weekend with that and with Notre Dame. But now he's back to the sort of, very much back to the day job. There was a columnist in one of the French papers I was reading yesterday. It said that Macron made a great speech about the France that he loves and now has to go back to work in the France that doesn't love him.
Yeah, so just in case listeners think, why are we spending so much time on France? It really, really matters. Just to remind people, it massively matters in the world. It's one of the largest economies in the world. But most importantly of all, as Donald Trump withdraws from the world, and we've had Elon Musk and Ron Paul tweeting that all US international aid should be cut. And I was talking to people in the US administration who said actually they think it's quite likely that Trump will cut all international development aid.
Mm.
This is the moment where Europe has to step forward. 400 million people. Europe's got 4 of the 10 largest economies in the world, 7 of the largest in GDP per capita. And what really matters in Europe? Germany and France. And unfortunately, Schulz, basically his whole coalition collapsed just after Trump was elected. And we have Macron in a position where, unless he can sort out his prime minister and his parliament, won't be able to pass the budget.
Yeah.
If he can't pass the budget, how's he going to provide extra support for the Western Balkans, Caucasus, Syria? And most importantly of all, and this is why it really matters to listeners, how is France going to support Ukraine? I mean, let's say Trump pulls out
Mm.
and Europe wants to say it really matters holding Putin back, that if Putin takes Western Ukraine or demilitarizes it, that is an existential security threat to the world order and to Europe, and Finland and Sweden and Britain and everyone comes forward. You need France. It's
Yeah.
one of the largest economies in Europe. And Macron is increasingly, I'm afraid, feeling like this figure who delivers grand speeches, but nothing happens. And Europeans are going to be looking at him thinking it doesn't really matter what the French president says, he can't follow through.
Well, maybe to underline that, and maybe this is our final point on France, is that whilst this was all going on, Ursula von der Leyen, who was in the original list of world leaders who would be attending Notre Dame, she didn't in the end. She wasn't there in the end. And I wonder whether that was related to the fact that while Macron has been weakened by this political position, she was off in Uruguay signing a trade deal between the European Union and Mercosur, Macron having specifically said France does not support it
Because of French farmers.
because of French farmers. And it's a huge deal, this thing. The European Union has been trying to get this over the line for about 20 odd years. Millet and Lula were at this thing. Millet, not a big fan of it, but sort of been persuaded. And this, of course, is about the change world of Trump because of the whole importance of tariffs that's coming in. So I think maybe next week we should maybe come back to this whole thing about tariffs and trade and how this relates. But listen, just a few minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about Farage.
Well, firstly, you went on Question Time with him, and you spent a lot of time with him before.
I did, and you can't underestimate what a sort of player he is within our politics right now. What I enjoyed about the actual program was that when I absolutely went for him over Brexit, and this was in Lincoln, which is a pretty Brexit area, but I've always felt with Farage, if you absolutely go for him over the damage that Brexit has done, you can get the public on your side. What is not happening enough in our politics, I'm afraid, is anybody wanting to talk about Brexit. But let's put part of that for a minute. So this week, for example, I've written about this in my several hours with Nigel Farage, and some of the things that he said, and I think they were quite revealing. Some of them. I mean, some of them is in the sort of the hail fellow well met stuff about God, the hospitality used to be so much better when Dimbleby was in charge. He used to get proper meal and decent red wine, and he said all that stuff. But just to give you some of the points that he was making. So he really doesn't rate Kemi Badenoch. I mean, that came over loud and clear. He said that in Parliament he sits next to Sammy Wilson,
And remind people, Sammy Wilson's Ulster MP,
Ulster Unionist, and Democratic Unionist, and he every time that Kemi Badenoch so far has stood up to ask her prime minister's questions, they sort of turned to each other and said, why is she going on that? So, for example, it was about Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, resigning.
Just sorry to parse that again for listeners. What Sammy Wilson and Nigel Farage are saying is that their political instincts are there are bigger, more obvious themes that the public will really respond to that Kemi Badenoch isn't yet finding.
Yeah.
So they would be standing up saying, I don't know, what would they presumably be focusing on, immigration or cost of living, would they?
But every time, every time she stood up and they've sort of thought, not sure why she's doing that.
Yeah.
Other things he was saying, he actually thinks the more that the Tories try to compete on reform on reform's agenda, the likelier it becomes that he becomes a bigger figure, not a smaller figure. And in his mind, I think what's in his mind is that the Tory party's done. Labour are not governing in the way that people wanted or expected. And he sees himself in a position to do a kind of reverse takeover of the Tory party.
And this then ties the fact that there's now these persistent stories that Elon Musk, who clearly really dislikes Keir Starmer and is very sympathetic to reform language and reform views on Britain, might give $100 million through UK companies.
Yeah, he denied that. He said he doesn't. He said he doesn't believe that story. He thinks it's nonsense, but he thinks the reason Elon Musk has turned on Keir Starmer is because Musk is a free speech absolutist. The reason why I think Starmer keeps going on about two-tier Keir is because it plays into Musk's belief that Keir Starmer is blaming social media for the riots and quotes locking people up for nothing. So he's definitely look. I think where I think we should worry about Elon Musk in relation to reform, it's perfectly obvious that Musk is going to put his weight behind it, and that is more about turnout. It's more about driving. We talked a lot about young men. It's driving people to vote.
We'll talk in our next podcast a bit about Romania, which is the most dramatic example we're looking at, where quite literally somebody from nowhere on the back of TikTok and 70,000 fake Russian accounts was close to sealing the election.
Exactly.
And we saw this also. I mean, why does Musk matter for reform? Why do we need to be worried? Well, partly because the other thing that Trump demonstrated is that in the modern world, you don't really need a ground game anymore. I mean, people like me were hypnotized by the fact he had no offices in Michigan. He had no volunteers out on the ground when the Democrats were doing all the good stuff traditionally that you did, knocking on doors, having well-run offices, getting your leaflets out. He instead came in on the back of things like doing interviews on a podcast on Joe Rogan. So in my opinion, we need to be more worried by Elon Musk almost than we are by Donald Trump. I think this guy is basically a fascist, in my opinion, says he, covering himself for the lawyers, right? And what I mean by that is this guy really wants to whip up a mob behind him. He gets immense narcissistic vanity and delight from being the leader of a far-right populist mob, and he'd love to have it running in Britain, in Germany, in Austria, as well as in the US. And we need to do campaign finance reform. I mean, the idea that one person could give £100 million. I mean, remember, British elections, not like US elections, they cost like 7-8 million. Someone giving 100 million is like 10 times as much as the entire election cost.
The other thing that was confirmed to me, and I've spent a fair bit of time with Farage in the past, but the other thing that was confirmed to me, he's one of those people in politics who sees you don't really talk about policy with Farage. He moves it very quickly onto positioning and strategy and media and process and personality. He told me he still reads 10 newspapers every day.
And he reads them presumably in order to get a feel.
He's getting a feel for where the papers are going.
Yeah.
So when he skim reads.
So when he and Sammy Wilson are sitting there watching the PMQs, it's partly sort of raw political instinct, skimming the headlines, just getting a sense of where he thinks the public is to land the killer blow every week. And I guess that's where you would have been too, right, in opposition. I mean, sorry, I don't want to, obviously you're coming from a very different direction, but you presumably, like Sammy Wilson Farage, will have tried to have quite a brutal, pragmatic view every week when you were in opposition on what you hit in PMQs that actually matters. How did you think about that?
Yeah, but we would always try to relate it to a bigger strategy. I think the point he's making is he doesn't have a sense of what strategy Kemi Badenoch is trying to put together.
Got you.
Nigel Farage has a pretty clear strategy, which is, it is populism. He's a populist right-wing politician who's trying to say that the elite are out of touch, the establishment are out of touch. I represent you, the people. Now, what I got from the audience is that actually, if you challenge that and confront that, you can puncture that balloon fairly quickly. But not enough politicians are doing that. Yeah, and I'll tell you the other thing that I thought was interesting, both from the audience and also from we'll do question time tomorrow, but from the many, many questions that we got this week, how few of them were about Keir Starmer's speech, which was made on that day. And so what I think, and this is the other point he made, he said, I got the sense he quite liked Keir Starmer and had a bit more respect for him than most people do. But his big, do you know what his big take on the speech was?
Yeah.
He's got to learn how to use an auto cue properly.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't use an auto cue, when he actually said to me, he said, when he stood in Downing Street and did that very short speech outside Downing Street, I can't remember the exact number. It's something like, he said, he looked down at his notes 134 times. I counted. He's like, it's all about presentation.
Well, we're coming to the end, and we'll take this up again tomorrow in question time. But I do think this is very interesting. I'm also just listening to you. intrigued by the fact that two people who disagree as profoundly as you do, and you've been unbelievably rude to each other in public, are still able somehow in the green room to have quite an interesting conversation.
Well, I arrived there early because I went up early to have lunch with my sister who lives near Lincoln. He arrived there early because he'd been tipped off that there was going to be a big demonstration against him. I felt because I used to get big demonstrations arriving at
Yeah.
Christian time, and that was him. But actually, the demonstration never turned up because, or a few people did, but not very many. And so we had several hours to kill. And look, it was interesting. He's definitely not stupid.
But unfortunately, you didn't manage to get him as an interview guest on Leading.
I'm intrigued by the fact that he is so reluctant to commit. And I think it's down to this thing. I think he genuinely he gets away with so much, right? I think he worries that an hour with us, we'd be polite, respectful, but we'd be able to pin him on stuff. And so I think he's very, very reluctant. So let's close the podcast by Nigel. I know you listen. I know you listen because your friend Andy Wigmore told me. And you're welcome to come on. I've asked you about 10 times now, and I cannot for the life of me think why you won't commit to come on Leading.
Very good. Let's hope he listens. Thank you, Alastair. Speak tomorrow.